Now for them to come in. Okay, looks like we have some people coming in. Hello, Charlene, Christine, Diana, Jan, Laura. Hi, everyone. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from. We always like to know. Natalie's in the Boston area. Cynthia is in Connecticut for the moment.
Actually, New York.
Oh, and you're in New York. And I am in West Hartford. And I know a lot of you are in Connecticut as well. Hi, Mary. Mary's from Hartford. As you put things in the chat, just make sure to put for everyone, not just for the hosts and panelists. Then all your fellow attendees can see your comments. And as we go along, as Natalie and Cynthia are having their conversation, and if you have any questions that strike you at that moment, please put it in the Q&A section. You don't have to wait until the Q&A time, which will be in about 40 minutes, I think. Hello, it looks like we have someone from Alabama and
I
South
like how
Country.
everyone's saying, they're up saying where they're from. I love that.
Yeah. Barkhamsted, Lincoln, Mass. Oh, I love Lincoln. Such a beautiful little town. Um, Plainville, Connecticut, Bantam. Awesome. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started, and you all can continue letting us know where you're from. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for Chasing Beauty, the life of Isabella Stewart Gardner. Virtual programs like this are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are very grateful to honor his memory with these programs. And I want to say a big thank you to our members. I know there are at least a few of you here tonight. If you're not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. There are so many benefits to becoming a member, especially if you watch a lot of or go to a lot of our author programs. You will receive free or discounted admission to our author programs, the House and Museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. Please visit our website for more information. And just one more thing about membership, you also get you get first notification of really interesting things that are coming up. I know we have that Percival Everett program coming up, and our members get first dibs on those tickets when new tickets become available. So that's another great part of becoming a member. Now on to our guests. Natalie Dykstra is the author of Clover Adams, A Gilded and Heartbreaking Life. Her work on Isabella Stewart Gardner has won a Public Scholars Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities and an inaugural Robert and Ina Caro Research Travel Fellowship sponsored by the Biographers International Organization. Natalie is the Emerita Professor of English at Hope College in Michigan. And our moderator, Cynthia Von Bueller, is an award-winning painter and author of picture books for children and the Minky Woodcock private detective graphic novels for adults. She lived in Boston from 1982 to 2000 before moving to New York City. She was infamous in Boston for many years, being called a quote-unquote art freak in the Boston Globe and featured on their billboards with the same headline. She was chosen as one of the most loved Bostonians by Boston Magazine and featured on the cover of the Improper Bostonian. Now, as I said earlier, during this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. But if you have a specific question, please post that directly into our Q&A section, which is on the bottom left of the screen. It has two word bubble icons, and you can put your question in there. That's all from me for now. I'll be back later. Please sit back and enjoy this, what I'm sure will be an amazing conversation about this really cool book. And I'll turn this over to Natalie and Cynthia.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi,
Thank
Natalie.
you.
I first I want to say that I loved your book. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for
and
having me.
Yeah, and it's actually when I lived in Boston, that was my favorite museum. And I
Yeah.
used to just go to the museum and just sit in that museum and read and write and draw. And it's a special place.
It is a
So
special place. I hear that often. People have a
yeah,
very strong attachment to it.
yeah, definitely. I know I do. So when I saw that you were on the list, I said, I want this one. I want to do this.
It's so
And
great.
I did not know a lot about Isabella. So it was really fascinating. I didn't know that she was a world traveler. And so it's almost like, she really traveled the world. And we're not just talking about here and there. I mean, like she went everywhere, really,
Yeah.
really. And so I was just wondering, like, how did these trips lead to the museum and her aesthetic?
Well, her travel really was how she educated her eye. She was, let me back up a little bit for those in our audience who aren't as familiar with Isabella as so many people in the Boston area, is that she was born in 1840. She marries into a Boston Brahmin family, Jack Gardner, in 1860. They have a series of tragedies early in their married life. Her first pregnancy ended in a stillborn birth. And then they had little Jackie in 1863. And he died of flu in 1865, in the last month before the Civil War ended. And so this was really a devastating loss. It derailed her for a time. And finally, her doctor, in consultation with Jack, encouraged overseas travel as a kind of travel cure for this incredible grief and sadness that she experienced. And so they first traveled to Northern Europe. There's a wonderful I loved reading about their travels by train in Russia. That so they were in Norway, Germany, England, and it's very clear that that first trip revived her. So I think she always associated travel with rebirth, and it was a way for her to be educated, right?
Mhm.
In that era, um,
Yeah.
college was not available. A higher education wasn't as available to women, and really for a woman of her social class was even less available, interestingly.
Oh,
And
really?
so travel was how she had spent 2 years in a Paris convent school, not in a Paris school, finishing school. Um, and so she knew French and Italian and read German, and she was very sophisticated already by the time she and Jack married. And so I think that set her I think travel became a passion for her, in
Mhm.
part because it was a way to educate her eye. And it's her eye, her capacity to respond to what she saw and experienced on these trips is really enlarged her life, what was possible for her. And she just had it's hard to really overstate the scale of her curiosity.
Mm.
And so then
And passion.
a
I mean, she was
couple
a
of
very
yeah
passionate.
they end up going to Egypt on the Nile in 1874, and then went through the Holy Lands, and
And they were camping.
they were camping.
I mean,
That's right.
they were intense sometimes. I mean, it
They
wasn't.
were. They were. And then they do a 18-month travel in the 1880s all through Asia. So she was in China, Cambodia. She
Yeah.
saw Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So she had, you know, by the 1890s, she had seen far more of the world than most Americans. Most
Mm.
Americans.
Absolutely.
She was
That's what
really a world traveler.
yeah.
And then she has special places that were very important to her. So they often stayed at the Palazzo Barbaro on the Grand Canal in Venice, and the Palazzo.
I want to go there now.
There's wonderful
I've been to Italy,
descriptions
but
of
not
that
Venice.
palace in
Yeah.
Henry James's novels. And he wrote actually parts of novels while he was staying there. And um, so they would they got into a routine that every 2 years they would go back to Europe. And yeah, there's a lot of travel in this book.
Yeah, it's anyone who loves travel, it's almost a travel book in a lot of ways, because you're talking about,
Yes,
and she had
yes.
all
I
those
mean,
miles.
that was the challenge of it, because there were so many
I found
details.
that
So
fascinating. Although I was a little jealous. Like, I have to
say that
say,
again.
you
Say that
know,
again, Cynthia. You were
oh, I was
jealous?
a little jealous, like, like the privilege of being able to travel like that. I mean, at such a young age too, starting young and getting educated in France, and it's amazing. She was very privileged. We'll get to that.
Yes, she was very privileged. Yep.
So she lost her son,
Yes.
Jackie, and she
Yes.
had miscarriages. I think she had 2 miscarriages. Is it 1 or 2? Did she have?
She had, she got pregnant again after Jackie's death, and then she lost that baby. And
Okay.
whether she was ever pregnant again, that I never was able to discover. But her
Right.
doctor did tell her she almost died in that after
I don't have any
that
more.
that miscarriage in late 1865, and her doctor said, you cannot have children. It
Yeah.
will kill you.
It seems to me like, because she lost Jackie, it was really horrible for her. She really loved being a mother. And I feel as though, I mean, as an artist, I feel like my art is my baby a lot of the time, it's projects that I love. And I feel as though this was her baby, like a baby that would never die. Like, she left this legacy. Don't you feel that way? Like, what do you think about that? Like, was it kind of like her baby? Like, having this.
That's a very interesting question. And I think there's like some steps in there. It's
Okay.
not a one-to-one correspondence, right? And she wouldn't have seen it that way either. It's not as if Fenway Court, which is what the museum was called before her death in 1924, and then it was by the will, it was named Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, but at the time it's called Fenway Court. So I refer to it as Fenway Court in my book. Is she would never say that it somehow replaced Jackie or made up for the loss of Jackie, or ever,
Yeah.
and so, but
I don't think she would admit it. But
the
it seemed like,
impulse to create, and this pursuit of beauty that accelerated in the years after Jackie's death. I think what I wanted to convey in the book was that there was a subtle connection, right? So it wasn't exactly direct, one-to-one, but there was she had to decide at 26. She had to decide at 26 who she was going to be, because sort of the doors to a more conventional life had been closed to her.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think what I came to so admire about her is she could have really folded up like a chair. She could have really quit life.
Yeah.
Right. And instead of that, and it took years, there was a long quiet. It really took years for her to sort of find her footing. But when she did, that's why I love the Zorn cover so much, the Anders Zorn of the cover of the book, these open arms.
Yeah.
It's so, it's so
Really, it's her.
expressive of her response to loss. And that's a very hard thing to do, to keep your heart open and to keep your curiosity and to keep and that felt like a story worth telling and exploring, I think. So there is a way that the loss is connected to Fenway Court, but it's a like more circuitous way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I see that. That's so interesting. It seems like that was sort of a golden age for house museums. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Edwin Booth Museum in Gramercy Park in New York.
No.
He's an interesting guy, but I held a play there, and he was an actor, a famous actor, and he was John Wilkes Booth's brother.
Yeah, I was going to say that must be the same family.
And anyway, he has a museum there, and it just seems like there was that was the time when everybody was opening museums, sort of like, but no women, of course. It just seems like
no women, and there's a way in which hers is a house museum, but not entirely the same in that same way as the Booth or as palaces, private house museums in Europe. So because she really designed it foundation to roof as
Yeah.
this Venetian palazzo that kind of rose off the Fenway when the Fenway had just been filled in.
There's really
And
nothing like it still. I mean, I
there's
don't know.
really nothing like it. There really isn't anything like it. So it's not like she lived first in it for years and then opened it up as a museum. She started the construction after Jack's death in 1899. He died in 1898 and it started in 1899 right away. And it opened in 1903. And it really was always then had access to the public. It wasn't as accessible as it is now. There were far fewer hours available, but
Is it
she
a
never.
nonprofit now?
Pardon?
Is it a nonprofit now?
Yeah, yes.
It is. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she on her travels, she was looking for parts to it. She was bringing back this heavy mantles and right.
Yeah, staircases. The staircase was fabricated in Venice. Yes, because she wanted it to be. It's interesting. Someone said she wanted it to be as authentic as possible. It quotes other Venetian palaces, but it's pieces of it here and there, right? And that's what's so astonishing about it is you can see her creative choices in and through the building itself, to what she put on the walls, to how all her chairs, she loved chairs, and just how she installed the galleries. But yeah, so she really conceived it as a museum as soon as she was starting to collect her masterpieces. So Vermeer in 1892, Titian in 1896,
What was the first
the
painting
Rape
that
of
she
Europa.
acquired?
Pardon?
What was the first painting she acquired? Like
the first paintings were really French Barbizon paintings, a Corot, I think that's I can't remember which room it's in. And it was the paintings that were so popular in Boston at the time. And these sort of genre scenes, landscape scenes, and they're beautiful.
Yeah.
They're beautiful. But it was somewhat conventional within sort of collectors. She was at Dahl and Richards a lot in here in Boston at their gallery. And then it's really on her travels, so she collects smaller things when she's in Egypt, not such large pieces. And then it's really the collecting really accelerates after her father's death in 1891, and she inherits her own money that they kept separate so she could use her inheritance to purchase paintings. And so and then that's when she starts to collect Rembrandt and the Vermeer and Titian and Botticelli and all those wonderful Italian
husband was so supportive.
Renaissance paintings. And it's also because she has this relationship with Bernard Berenson, and he comes back into her life in 1894. And so now he by that point is a specialist in Italian Renaissance artwork. And so it's really, now she has an expert and a dealer, a connoisseur, to
and
help.
Norton too. Didn't she study under Norton a little bit?
And yes, absolutely. She studied under Charles Eliot Norton in the 1870s. And she became part of the Dante Club because she studied Italian. She had studied it in school, and then she started studying it again so she could read Dante in Italian. And she was an important member because she financially supported the Dante Club. And then he then encouraged her to start collecting rare books. There's a wonderful line from Henry James in a letter that she loved fashion and jewels. And Henry James says, don't spend all your money on dresses.
Yeah, she had these big long pearls. I loved how she wore
Yes,
these big pearls, and then there was a jewel like right down, like below, like right. It was kind of daring, you know what I mean?
yes,
Like
very
here,
daring. Yes, that
I
became kind of her signature. That was very much her signature style, is the sort of three ropes of pearls. And Jack would buy every 2 years they were in Europe, and he would go to Boucheron in Paris, right near there where they like to stay at the Hotel Westminster and near the opera.
Mhm.
And he would purchase a string, and then she would add to the string, and then she would add and add and add, and then there was some
It was
rubies,
so
drop
long.
rubies. Yeah, yeah, it's very, very long.
They were rare back then. In your book, it said that they were very rare back then because they weren't culturing them,
Yes,
right?
that's
So
exactly right. It was, and I went to the Boucheron actually has, I'm not saying that, Boucheron has a archive. And so I went to Paris. That was a fun research trip to talk to the archivist there, because I wanted to see the receipts of the purchases of the pearls, because they were so important to her sort of
speaking of
visual.
that, your research was so amazing. Like you really dug into it. Like you
I
must have
did.
just been buried under letters and books and meetings and right? I love that.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think for biography, it's everything. Everything is about the sources. Everything is about
Hmm.
the sources. Um, as I said to another audience, your contract with the reader is that this is what I'm telling you in those chapters is based on evidence that I have from secondary and primary sources. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, it's why it takes so long to write a biography. Um,
Yeah.
Especially someone with such a long life, especially with someone for such a long life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever thought about writing fiction or?
I am so inspired by archival research. I love sort of the tiniest detail that I can find, and that really spurs my imagination. Um, I love looking at weather reports. I was telling a friend just earlier today that I wanted to imagine what it was like for her after Jackie's death in 1865. What would that have been like to be 26 and married and see all these children? In Boston, so I looked at all the census records of everyone who lived on Beacon Street, and I sort of counted up, this house had 5 kids, that house had 4 kids, this one, and
Oh,
I
I
just
love looking at census
I
records.
imagined those children
Yeah.
running up and down the street to the public
Yeah.
garden right nearby, and the
Oh, that came
common.
across. You said that in your book, like that the kids would go and play in the garden,
Yes,
public.
yes.
I,
And what
I
what
actually
was
lived
that
at
really like for
390.
her? That was
I
the
lived at
question. Go ahead. I was just going to say,
I
in one way,
yep.
that detail of how many kids were in each house, I didn't end up using in the book, but it helped me
Yeah.
picture, right?
Oh yeah, that came across. That's something that I even remember that the kids were running up and down Beacon Street and running to the park because you think, oh, if you know Boston, you know the park is right there.
Yes.
What a great place! What a great place to have in your backyard, right? The
Yes.
park,
It's a beautiful part of the city
right?
for sure. Yes, it's a beautiful part of the city. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So the research is just a very, the closer you can be to the sources, I got very, very fortunate in the timing that I had done so much primary source research before the pandemic. So I had just
Mhm.
started to write chapters in 2019. So
Oh, okay.
because
So you
to
did,
see the stationery and to see her signature kind of scrawled across the page, that becomes really telling. It tells you state of mind. It tells you, um, um,
yeah.
right?
I
And
think you said something about you met with some of the people in her family who are still alive and they were older now. But who was
yeah, I
that? Like,
mean,
who did you meet with?
Gardners were a very large family, and of course, Jack and Isabella didn't have any direct descendants, but he was very close to his brothers, the Gardner brothers, and they also took care of Jack's oldest brother died, and those boys were orphaned, and they ended up in the care of Jack and Isabella. And so there's descendants from that branch, but then there's a oldest brother, George Augustus Gardner, and those Gardners, yes, I have met descendants of George Augustus Gardner, and it's been the high privilege. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to be. I know their family history better than I know, in some ways, my own. I know the dates, and
Yeah.
it is an extraordinary thing to meet descendants. It's really yeah, it's
What were they
extraordinary.
like? Are they kind of, are they still like that kind of style? Do they
I
speak
mean,
that
that's
way?
they're private people, so but I
It could be even listening to us right now.
I have such high admiration for the family, and
Yeah.
they've really welcomed this book, and so that's incredibly satisfying. I mean, I'm very, very grateful. Um,
Yeah.
they're really
I'm
wonderful people. They're wonderful people. So
That's great. Yeah, I'm not
one of the
surprised.
great blessings of Isabella's life is that she married into such a good family. Um,
Yeah.
and
They loved
the
her.
brothers, there's all these letters that are that I had transcribed, and at the Massachusetts Historical Society right nearby, and on the Fenway, and the way these brothers would write to each other was so moving. They were very the temperature of the family was
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah, I remember that letter that
it was a great good for her, great good fortune that she was
when
that
his
she
brother died, he wrote a really moving letter to his brother
yeah,
about his own loss.
yes.
It was really well written and heart-wrenching.
And
And
what I was saying to a friend, they were only in their 20s when they're writing these letters about ultimate meaning. How do we move forward after losing children? And
you know what? That's so true. Like nowadays, like nobody would have the capacity to write a letter like that. I mean,
it was
right?
very, they were just reaching out to each other. Jack and Isabella were in Boston, and George Augustus Gardner, his oldest brother, had lost 2 children in Paris to a cholera epidemic. And that was all happening in 1865. And so they were writing back and forth these letters. And it was extraordinary to transcribe those letters, because they were it was as if they were reaching across the Atlantic to comfort each other. And then I just was always startled by how young they were and how wise they were, really, in some ways. So yeah.
I wanted to talk about privilege a little
You want to
bit.
talk about privilege? What do you want?
I don't know. I feel like that she was very privileged. And privilege is such a big thing now. It just seems like with, people, like there's only so many people who are really wealthy, and then there's so many people who are poor. And it's just like I just kept thinking about privilege, and I kept thinking about how now how people with that type of wealth, billionaires, they want to go to Mars. Everybody wants to go to Mars. Like Musk wants to go to Mars, and Bezos wants to go to Mars. It's like they're not supporting the arts. And it's really interesting, like how, like in this day and age, that the arts aren't considered to be something that is as worthwhile as going to Mars. What do you think about that?
I mean, that is a big, that's a big topic. I think what we are in a second golden age, or gilded age, and gilded means the surface is covered in gold, but there's not what's in the interior is not, right. It's a Mark Twain. It comes from Mark Twain, and the phrase. And so I can speak to that the 19th century time, this sense of in Boston and in New York, but within these Boston families, there was this extraordinary pride in being American and building up institutions for people who didn't have the privilege, right? So all those beautiful Carnegie libraries, of course,
Yeah.
and the Boston Public Library was one of the very first public libraries where books were accessible to average citizens, right? There was, and of course, all the extraordinary educational institutions in Boston, and the Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Athenaeum. The list is very long. And these institutions were founded and sustained and created by the wealth of these families, and in that early period. And there was they really saw it as an expression of citizenship. They really saw it as, this country has blessed me, and it's my obligation to give back. And so in some way, Fenway Court is her response to that privilege, right? Is to make art available more widely, because seeing art in all those beautiful palaces in Europe wasn't available to most Americans. She knew that. So she wanted a palace in Boston for people to be able to experience something of what she had experienced. And in that way, it's a very sort of democratizing impulse, right? To make things possible for people who don't have access.
I wonder if that's what they're thinking as far as going to Mars. Oh,
yes, and it's a different era. And I think, there are so many people, philanthropists, who are still supporting the arts. And so I think it's, I won't want to say that that's not the case. But I do think that in her era, there was this feeling of pride. We want to better the country. We want to improve it. We want to, and there was this feeling also that Americans were behind culturally, that Europe had culture. We had money in the Gilded Age, right? But we didn't have the cultural institutions that.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Like, it was something that was needed, right? They wanted,
that's right. That's right. And there was, American literature, as we study it now, there wasn't an American literature department in the we didn't have it. The idea was we didn't have a literature to study. That was from, right? There was this feeling like we were so far behind culturally. And so that also is an impulse behind her desire to have that for Bostonians and Americans. She understood that it was going to appeal beyond Boston. So these are good questions.
I have a lot of questions. I remember the Heist, the 1990s Heist. I was living in Boston. That was a big deal. Didn't someone come in and take a box cutter and just cut the art out of the painting? And they haven't found the paint. They haven't found those paintings.
That's an ongoing investigation.
Wow.
And because she dies in 1924, this happens in 1990. And when I was first sort of imagining the sections and chapters, and because do I start with the heist? Do I start with a scene of the heist and then back up into her story? And it just was so clear to me that story, that catastrophe for a museum, is for them to tell. It's not my story to tell as a biographer. So at the end, in the epilogue, I have an epilogue that addresses the theft, but I'm just, because it's also an open investigation, really, other people know more about it than I do. It's just not in the.
I guess I'm surprised that they never found the art. Like, they never, all these years, and you'd think somebody must just have it in their private collection.
Yeah, we just don't know. We just don't know. It's 30 years now, or 34 years, I think now. And so it is a great mystery, and people are fascinated by it. But in one way, of course, it happened at her institution, but in another way, it's not really a part of her story. And it's the museum story.
Yeah, right? That's true. So, you're right. It's still shocking, but
no, it is striking, and I get asked about it. For sure.
So I love Edith Wharton. I love her books. I actually like them better. Well, I love Edith Wharton, and you probably do too.
Yes, how could you not?
And
Great.
and you were saying that they weren't friends. And I wonder, what do you think? Like, why?
They were 20 years apart. They were exactly 20
Who was
years
older?
apart.
Edith was
So
older?
Gardner is older. Yes,
Okay.
Gardner is
Oh,
20 years older. So she's in really another generation. She's really, it's a different generation. And you know, what's interesting is, of course, Wharton's novels are so descriptive, especially Age of Innocence, are so descriptive of the world that Gardner inhabits, right? So
yeah.
she's a wonderful source, right? There's a great phrase she has, I think it's in a hieroglyphic world of high society, which I love, because it was such a hieroglyphic world. So in one way, it's, you know, they have so much in common, and they had common friends. And so but they were this generation apart, and they just were two very big personalities. It was almost as if there wasn't room enough in a room for both. And I think it is the case that Wharton sort of would have thought and sort of tried to thought about Gardner more than reversed, right? I think certainly I looked, so there's a record of her library, and I want in her private library, and I wanted to see all the books, all the novels that she had, and she certainly had all of Wharton's novels.
She
And
did.
she had Twain's, she had Mark Twain's novels as well.
Did she know Samuel Clemens?
She did not know, and I looked. Gardner had a wonderful wit, and she loved to laugh. And, you know, I imagined her reading Twain, but I never had evidence that that's not to say it's not out there, but I couldn't find it. So there were no letters exchanged. There was no, yeah, that was not an author that she personally knew.
At the same time too, but she did read her books.
Yes, yes, you know, she loved detective fiction. She loved, so she had Brookline Public Library ship her books, the most recent detective fiction. And so she loved, yeah, she had a wide reading life. She loved to read art history. She loved to, she took notes on the history of artists that she was interested in. But it, you know, always, because it's based on sources, you know, she doesn't have margin. She didn't make marks in her books.
Yeah.
And when a subject like Henry Adams, a subject of my previous book, he had all this wonderful marginalia. And so then I knew exactly what he was even responding to in the paragraphs.
Yeah.
And she didn't do that. And so
do you do that?
She didn't know. I think there was, no, she really didn't mark her books.
But do you mark your books?
Do I mark my books? Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think I do it through Post-its, and yeah, some I do, but not as a general practice. I have, you know, part of my writing practice is to keep a journal that I sort of carry around wherever I go. And so if there's a scene or a phrase or a title or anything, that I have a way to keep track of it, kind of a working journal. And that was incredibly useful over time. And then, you know, that I have 3-ring binders, and I have itineraries, all their travel itineraries taped to my wall. And, you know, there's all these ways that you have to.
I wanted to ask you about your writing. I really love your writing style.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind.
I think it's very authentic for this type of history, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I do think you should probably try to write fiction, because I could see you writing something pretty but
I think the genres are very different. They seem similar, but they're really very different. The sort of the requirements, the contract with the reader, it's just a really different. But biography definitely borrows certain aspects from fiction.
Well, you're
in terms of building scenes, and yeah. And you want to, sorry, I'm interrupting you. Go ahead.
I wanted to know more about your writing and who are some of your favorite writers are, and how you came to writing.
Oh, how did I come to writing? I mean, I think it's something I just always wanted to do, but it wasn't such a direct route. And so I love school. I love school. And um that was sort of my strongest part of school, was when I had papers, and I very much enjoyed that. And I went and got my PhD, and then I was an English professor, and I had a PhD in American Studies, so I really studied kind of history, literature, and art history. And so it was really my turn to writing my book on Clover, where I really wanted to write for a wider audience if I could. And then you have to figure out ways to really, you're a storyteller when you're a biographer. You're telling it's a true story, but you're still telling a story. And
Right.
and in that way, it needs to have a shape, and it needs to have pace and tension, and you want to have that feeling at the end of a chapter that you want to read the next chapter.
Hmm.
And so I learn so much from fiction, for sure. You know what? The other thing that I did that was, as I was learning this, sort of how to write in this way, was I listened to a lot of directors' commentaries, in the
Oh,
good old days with DVD commentaries,
I love
before
those.
streaming.
Yeah.
Yes. And so because they're such skilled storytellers, Martin
Hmm.
Scorsese and Alan J.
Yeah.
Pakula, and they had these wonderful commentaries on some of their best movies. And I was very interested in this idea of close up and wide shots that
Hmm.
directors uses, and that was very helpful to figure out how to pace a chapter. Sometimes you want to get really, really close to her, and
Yeah.
you want to know what she was wearing, and you want to know the weather, and you want to know who came for lunch, and you just want to slow the narrative down a little bit so you can see her and be very. And then sometimes you need to talk about sort of Boston politics, or you need to go out and have a wide shot. So now you're seeing sort of the historical context, and it's that back and forth that makes it feel like it sort of has a breath, or that it moves. And
Yeah.
I that really comes from film directors. They
Yeah.
talk about that, how they think about that, and that was exceedingly helpful
Yeah, I can see that
to
in your book
me.
now. I can see that. That's interesting. Wow. I'm glad I asked that question. You,
Thank you for
I
the
know we
question.
want to ask some questions.
Yes,
We've got about 15 minutes left. Should we
yes,
take some questions?
yes. I would love
Are
some
there?
questions.
Um, let's see. Does anyone have questions here? Someone says they were at the museum on the day before the heist.
Oh,
Oh,
oh, so you saw the Vermeer and
here he is. Here's Omar.
and Rembrandt.
Hi. Yes, it looks like we have some questions. Uh, we have a couple questions about the robbery. We won't touch on those. Um, Beth asks, hello and thanks. What other books would you recommend in addition to your own to understand and appreciate Isabella Stewart Gardner? Her letters, for example?
Oh, yes. There's a wonderful collection of letters between her and Bernard Berenson that was published. It's the only sort of large collection of letters that you can purchase. And then there's also a smaller one by Pushkin Press, a smaller press, on the letters between her and Henry James. That's also worth investigating. And then I would really go to the museum. There's wonderful publications by the museum. They put out a smaller biography of her life in 2022, and that is worth reading, as well as in 2017 they wrote a new guide to the collection, and that is also a wonderful, wonderful resource. And then there's these other earlier publications on her time in Venice, and they're all in my endnotes. All those titles you can find in my endnotes, and bibliography. But yeah, there, it was interesting how she showed up in other people's biographies. She's a figure that's often referred to in other stories, and it was just wonderful. It was a privilege to sort of put her at the center of a longer narrative. So she takes really center stage.
Hmm.
I don't know. I think that's, yeah. I'm just
Chris-
reading it's not on Isabella, but I do want to say this about a wonderful book, All the Beauty in the World by Patrick Bringley, is a recent book about, he was a museum guard at the Met, and he writes so beautifully about paintings and standing in front of masterpieces. And it's just been my favorite read this spring. So I also recommend, if you're interested in reading about art and
What was the title again?
it's called All the Beauty in the World. Such a great title as well. Patrick Bringley. It came out last year. And
I like that idea that it's
it
somebody who
is.
works in the museum that's like there and seeing everybody's.
Yes. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. Yeah.
He wanted to get in.
Christine wants to know, from all your research, how would you describe Isabella's personality?
She was fierce. She was untiring. She was determined. She filled a room. There's a great line about how she would glide across the room like a boat in full sail, is one of my favorite lines about her. She moved beautifully. She was an athletic. People knew when she was in the room. She had a lot of charisma. She loved to laugh. She listened very intently when she would lean forward to listen to people when they talked to her. And, she made very quick judgments. She was very fast. She was incredibly smart. She had a terrible temper. I think there's a wonderful sort of anecdote that's told in multiple earlier biographies too, that Jack Gardner, her husband, told some of their household servants, if she fires you, don't pay any attention. Come to me. So sometimes she would lose her temper. She was fiery, and she had very strong opinions, which I loved about her. I mean, it scared me sometimes to have that kind of. I think she was pretty intense personality. Um, but in order to accomplish what she did, that's what she needed. She needed that drive. Yeah. I hope that answered that question. I hope you can kind of visualize her. She moved beautifully. I mean, she moved like a dancer. And she was a great dancer.
I think the book really does a good example, like really makes you feel like you know her.
That's
her. I really, like I could see that she would be pretty intimidating. She was, I wonder, would you have liked her, do you think?
I've been asked that before. Would you be friends with her? And I admire her enormously for who she became. And I don't know if is quite the right frame for that. I think I sort of don't get, because I'm a 21st century person and she's a 19th century person, I don't want to get too cozy. 19th century people were very formal. I would not have called her Isabella. I would have called her Mrs. Gardner, like all her friends. Henry James called her Mrs. Gardner, right? So they had a formality with each other that is unfamiliar to us in the 21st century. And so I think to think about whether I would like her is to bring her into the 21st century when she's in the 19th.
I have a question I forgot to ask, and
yes.
It's a gossipy question.
It's a what?
A gossipy question.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if you think she consummated that affair with that man. What was his name?
Frank Crawford, it was his name. Marion Crawford. It was in the mid 1880s, and they definitely had a romantic friendship. There's definitely flirtation, and he paid her a lot of attention at a time when it seems like she was a little bit out of sorts. She was in her early 40s, and there's no way to know for sure. And when you don't have a way to know for sure, you tell your reader there's no way to know for sure. And because they're real people in the past, it feels important to not claim something that you don't know for sure.
Yeah.
So I will say this, it seems unlikely that they consummated it in a physical sense, because he comes back into her life, and that seems impossible that he would come back later.
And her husband was so good about it. Like her
And
husband,
her husband,
let's just
he
go on
didn't
another
like it.
topic.
Yes, he kind of didn't like it, and he didn't like to
Just
be the
took her
subject.
away.
Yeah, and he took her to Asia, Japan first, and so yeah, that was a painful era, a time of their marriage for sure. But of course, they didn't keep records about it. If there was anything written down, so you have to find it through other people's recounting of that
There's a
chapter took me.
photo though of them holding hands, no?
Yes, there is a
Kind of
photo,
proof,
a record
no?
of that bond. There's a record of that bond. But what I did find a very interesting detail is she kept his baby hair. Somehow he gave her a lock of his baby hair and a baby picture. And that is not really what a lover keeps. That's really what a mother keeps as a memory. And so he was 16 years younger than she was. So it seemed like this was, so I that chapter took a long time for me to write because the silence in the archive and wanting, yeah, that took a long time for me to
I
figure that
like
out.
that you said that in your book that you mentioned that about keeping the baby hair and the fact that maybe it was she missed her son and she was sort of trying to fill it
I
in.
think it was her connection to the next generation. It was her connecting to the next generation. And he represented youth and vitality and what's coming next. And he was very smart and he spoke all these languages and he paid her a lot of attention. And I think that was, pretty, it caught her eye. And
I see another question here that looks interesting. Was she accepted in society at the time?
no, not initially, for sure. She was really, for reasons that some parts we know and some parts we really don't know. She was never invited to what was called sewing circles here in Boston. And those were kind of your social group. And once you got into a sewing circle of women, and they did more than sew, but it was
So
a
boring.
sort of social world. Yeah. And you stayed with that group your whole life. You stayed, it was and Jean Strauss, in her brilliant biography of Alice James, the youngest sister of William Henry James, has a wonderful description of these sewing circles. And she was never invited into one. You had to be invited. It was like a sorority in that way. You had to be invited. And she was never invited. And that meant that she missed out on a whole sequence of sort of this sort of Boston social life. And but there came a time when it was clear people were starting to accept her invitations to dinners or a ball or her social invitations because they didn't want to miss out on what was going to happen. So that was it, and she had this great fortune of marrying into the Gardner family who accepted her. So, but she was from elsewhere. She wasn't a Bostonian. She wasn't born here. She was born in New York. So it's a good question.
Lynette wants to know, what was the thing that surprised you the most in researching her?
Oh, there were so many things that surprised me. I think one thing that felt like a discovery was the depth of her sort of spiritual life. And I'd always felt like there was a spiritual aspect to the museum, and there was all this religious iconography, but she was quite involved with her church. And then there was a Protestant or Episcopalian monastery in Cambridge here, still exists, called the Society of St. John the Evangelist. And she was very involved with those brothers, and they became even more important as she aged. And so that was a sort of red thread. I thought of it as a red thread that kind of moved through the book like tapestry, like a tapestry thread. So that was did it surprise me entirely? No, not maybe surprise, but it added a dimension to her story that I felt was really important. And I think aspect, it was her religious faith was liberating force in her life. And she never wanted other people to believe she didn't proselytize, or she wasn't an evangelical by any stretch, but she was fascinated in belief of all kinds. So Buddhist, she was interested in Buddhism, and she loved to go to temples in Japan, and she loved the sound that was inside the temple. She wrote about that. So she was very attuned to religious practices, and that was really interesting to me. So that's a good question.
Yeah. And Mickey or Mikey, you mentioned absences in the archives. Do you notice holes in her story that might have been purposefully removed? Purposefully removed.
Yeah, I think probably her relationship with Crawford, there was probably more evidence in letters back and forth that would have told us more that she had destroyed. She asked her friends to destroy her letters, and in fact, she had one of Jack's relatives wrote her and said, I'll destroy your letters, but it sort of breaks my heart because you write such great letters. I obey your wishes, but I wish I didn't have to, And then the question is, why did people burn their letters? And I think it does have to do with a sense of privacy. There was just was nobody's business, was the feeling. And Henry James burns letters, and Henry Adams burns letters. There's lots of evidence for this, and especially because she knew, she had become a well-known person, and so she just wanted aspects of her life that were private.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jane asks, do you feel Emily Franklin's The Lioness of Boston is a fair representation of Isabella Gardner?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's so as a biographer, and this is common with biographers, I don't read historical fiction of my time period, because I can't have scenes that are fictional kind of competing with the sources. And so I have not read Emily's book, and I know it's very popular, and I think it's so interesting that Isabella inspires all these different kinds of responses to her story. That I find fascinating, but I defer the question because I don't read fictional representations of Henry James or Henry Adams or anyone else, because I just have to be very sure in my mind where I'm getting details.
Yeah, that's
question,
completely
though.
fair.
Pardon?
That's completely fair.
Yeah, it just is. I mean, we talk about it, biographers. Some. I have a friend who's a biographer, and she's totally able to read across the genres. And I can read, if it's a period that's, Hilary Mantel, I can read.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, that's fair.
You can read all the Tudor
yes, I can
historical
read
fiction that you want.
I can read all of that, but I can't read anything that's set in the 19th century in my period, the Gilded Age period. So
absolutely. Well, we have some more questions, but we're starting to get to the last few minutes here. I guess I'll close off with Wilma's question. We're not going to talk about the theft, but would you discuss the restrictions of her will?
oh yes, that's a good question. So in her will, there was the name change, so from Fenway Court to Isabella Stewart Gardner, because she knew most likely the men around her were going to get credit for what she had done. So she was going to insist that we not forget her. And she was very smart that way. And it also stipulated that the paintings couldn't be moved. So the galleries appear now currently as very close to how they appeared in her lifetime. And that's stipulated in the will. That really guides the decision making of the museum. So that she knew, if in maybe 10 years after her death, people would have kept it the way she wanted it, but 50 years after her death, she suspected that they would move things around, so she made it a legal document.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
And we get an idea not only, of what she was interested, but also
Yes.
how people envisioned museums at that time,
Yes.
which is so different from the way that we set up museums now.
Yes, that you see paintings in situ, right? So she wanted you to see the image not just as an image, right? But to see what kind of furniture, what kind of fabric would be on the walls. So you're taking it all in, that it's this
Immersive, right?
immersive experience. It's not
Yeah.
just you still have a relationship to the artwork individually, but it's within this context. Yeah, that was incredibly important to her. Yep. Because that's how she experienced art in Europe, right? She
Mhm.
experienced it in these palaces and these private
Yeah.
collections. And so,
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Natalie. This has been amazing. And for those of you who haven't read Chasing Beauty, please do. You can get it from our museum store on our website, or you can come and visit us. You don't have to take the whole tour. You can just go to the store to buy the book. But if you want to take the tour, that's awesome too. Or see one of our exhibits, that's great. So yeah, buy Natalie's book, Chasing Beauty. Learn more about Mrs. Gardner. We'll say Mrs.
yeah,
Gardner.
yeah.
And thank you so much, Cynthia.
Thank you,
Pleasure. I
Cynthia.
really love the book. I think everyone should get out and read it. It's
Oh, thank you so much for your support. And thank you for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it so much.
Thanks.
So
And thanks everyone for joining us. Please join us soon for another event. Have a great evening.
thank you. Thank you, everyone.
bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.